Storytelling your first Vampire the Masquerade Chronicle can be intimidating. I know, I did it once. So here are some of the mistakes that I made that hopefully you can see coming with a little bit of lore, rules, preparation, so that your first few sessions and the bits that come before will go a bit more smoothly. So here's 5 things that I wish I knew going into my first Chronicle. Welcome, strange adventurers. I'm Josh, and I love Vampire the Masquerade and all things World of Darkness. So let's dive in to number 1. What are the most important parts to remember for your first session? Straight up, when you are going into your first session, we'll get to the preparation, the things you need beforehand later. In your first session, if you're at this point, you need to have 3 things in my mind, nothing else. If you're doing what I do and go in with bare minimum, you need 3 things. A short-term goal, and that can be as simple as go and meet the prince, go and kidnap this person, or something very simple and tangible for your players to focus on. Go and get the MacGuffin. Then bring it back to their character's sire, and the sire will tell them, oh, you did a terrible job, I hate you so much. That kind of thing. Something that they can very concretely go and do. And it doesn't even have to be that challenging. It has to establish their relationships between each other. It has to establish how they can even interact with the rules of the game. Give them some roles to do so that they're, breaking through a door, trying to hunt a person, drink their blood, some very basic vampire stuff, so that they're all on the same page and they're all working together towards this one goal. And while they're doing that, leave them plenty of space for them to talk with each other and ask you questions. And that will come up in a moment. The next thing is to establish, as you're going through, a long-term goal. Now, this one's a bit more tricky. Is it something that the players want collectively? Is it something that an NPC wants for the players? Does someone want to become the prince? Does a NPC want them to join a secret cabal faction that they don't know about yet? This should appear to the players quite obviously. I feel it should be obvious to them a question that they cannot answer. What is this mysterious symbol, and why is it splattered all over the city in blood? That kind of thing that really gets them thinking about the place that they're in and their position in vampire society. You'll have your own ideas, which are much better for your group than mine are. So this can give them, pause for thought and let them debate it. And even if they're right, that doesn't matter. Give them voices in their head. Give them literally anything that they can't answer. And a thing that you will need to be doing during your first session is noting down questions that they ask you. Like, where does this vampire live? That kind of scale of questions. Things that they don't necessarily know that they're interested in finding out. Where do we find a flame shotgun so we can kill this vampire? Or where do the werewolves hang out? They don't know yet. But if they're asking you, they're interested. So having that to prepare something to answer those questions later when the werewolves turn up and tear them to shreds is fun for them and for you, and makes it feel very responsive. So those are the bare minimum things that you need for your first session. While you're preparing for your first session with your table, it's really important to set the tone. How do you set tone? Well, Vampire describes itself as a personal horror game, which is definitely in a modern gothic horror setting, but I think that personal horror is my favorite way of describing it, because while you are describing the world and the actions of people, it's important to remember that unlike something like D&D, you are not heroes. Your players are monsters, and they have to fight against the beast. their worst instincts for lust, blood, money, power, fight against that if they want to retain their humanity. And that is an if. They might give in to temptation. And that is something that you will have to put in front of them, whether their loved ones are under threat, whether something they want to achieve or obtain is over there. They will probably have to do something unpleasant if they want to make the most of it and grab it for themselves. And what makes it personal is that in a world where the players are often the least powerful thing around, and they are thrown around by the whims and tides of more experienced or uncaring sometimes people, vampires, the personal horror is their wrestling with their emotions and what they want to be in this second life. And for that, I think it's important to remember that sometimes the players themselves will be the threat to the thing they like or want most. Their beast, or whether it be just their straight up desire to achieve something without anything supernatural going on, should probably cause something else horrible to happen to them, or maybe even their coterie. And I think the only lore thing that your players need to understand for this to be the tone that you want to achieve is that beast. It is central to their character and to their temptations. And while you're coming up with things that will happen in this tone, I literally just steal things from my favorite vampire movies or horror movies. Like, once I had a really great session where I did the bloodbath party scene from Blade, but from the vampire's perspective, where a fun, drenched blood party, maybe they love it, maybe they don't, some did, some didn't, suddenly becomes a horrifying, inescapable slip and slide when a vampire hunter with a big flaming shotgun turns up. Whatever you enjoy about vampire, that's where the story should go. And all the things that your table like about vampire. And this is probably the most important part. Table agreement. When everyone consents to including horrifying things, people get more invested. So ask people what they do want included. Do they want manipulation, gaslighting, sex, violence, themes of abuse? Like, people do want these things, and getting their enthusiastic buy-in before you start playing is a great way for people to start thinking about how their character would react to these situations. And, that gets creative for everyone. And it also makes it really easy to leave out things that will make people at your table uncomfortable. Now, here's a really weirdly specific one that comes up quite often. How many vampires should there be in your city? It's a really difficult question to answer, and it really has several different ways of answering it. First off, let's go with how most people talk about it, which is, in an ideal world, how would the masquerade be protected? If everything was even and there were enough people to hide the deaths and the murders and inconvenient blood loss of people just straight up getting eaten, just at a base level, people getting eaten every single day by the vampires in the city. Kai the GM did a really good video on this, and he said about 3,000 people per vampire, which quite a lot, but maybe not as many as you would expect. That way, that's enough people to hide amongst. It, blends in with the statistics of what's an average accident rate for various different places, and that can go up or down depending on the dangerousness of the city in the real world that you choose. However, the world does not exist in an ideal state. It is a world of darkness. and therefore those 3,000 people will probably be owned or maybe just in the domain of another vampire, inaccessible specifically to you. So how many people will you realistically have? Maybe, if you're lucky and spend a bunch of points in herd or retainers, anywhere between 1, maybe 12. That's a small group. Enough to hide in? Not really. And the most important question that you need to answer when you're deciding how many vampires are actually in your city is this a problem? And normally the most interesting answer is yes. There are not enough people for the number of vampires in this city. That links into some of the lore where there are very young vampires, very weak vampires who don't necessarily know the rules, running around, ruining things, putting small holes in the masquerade and risking vampire hunters, the Inquisition, coming down on your city. Now, that might not be important if the Second Inquisition isn't in your story. If vampire hunters aren't important to you, then don't answer this question in specifics. But normally, the most interesting answer is there are too many vampires. Is it a sign of the end times, or is it just a massive problem? That's up to you to decide. This is another really specific rules one that I find gets asked and answered in a bunch of different ways. How much XP should your players be getting and how? I have a really specific answer for this one, actually, and it is because of the balancing of the character sheet. I tend to find that around 120 XP points is the point beyond which a character becomes very, very powerful and can be quite unwieldy. Realistically, because of the way experience points are spent, when you get a certain number, you don't level up. You spend a number of experience points based on how high of a level of a dot that you want to add to your character sheet, whether that's a new power at 3rd level, that's 15 experience points. I know because I've spent a lot of experience. Or if you want to gain a dot in a new skill, that's 3 experience points, and we'll give you more dice when you're rolling that skill. This balances things out quite nicely, where either they can spread them out quite thinly across a bunch of different things, or they can really stack them on something they really, really want to use. Like if they get up to level 5 dominate, that makes them extremely powerful with mind control powers, but obviously leaves them weak elsewhere, where you may want to think about providing them challenges that threaten or give them dice rolls to do outside of that dominate stat, or whatever it is they've stacked all their stuff into. So it doesn't balance out badly, but there is an unwieldy point past which they become ridiculously powerful monsters. But, you know, plot can deal with that. You're the GM, you have infinite dice. No, don't ignore that bit. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the game becomes a breeze, because dice roll how they roll. That doesn't mean that you will always succeed, that's for certain. But they do end up with quite large dice pools and quite a variety of tools, and that can be a lot of fun if you're playing a high-powered game, if you want them to mess things up in horrific ways, then give them lots of experience points. But if you're having a very short 3-session campaign, for example, then maybe if you want to keep them invested, you should give them a certain amount, maybe 10 experience points per session. And then they can get something like maybe a new power to play with for the next session. It's also important to think about whether that's how you want to do it at all. Is it based on milestones per session, or whether per story arc? That's how I do it most often, is when they finish kind of a chapter, they've got a mission to do, they finish that off, they get a bunch of experience points to spend because they've got some downtime, which is kind of very Blades in the Dark heisty way of doing it, which is quite fun. But equally, it could be based on the actions that they do. if they do something very humane, you should give them an experience point. Or perhaps if they do something really thrilling or really enjoyable for another player, they should get an experience point. And I think giving out experience points should be based on the behaviors that you want to see, whether that's just turning up for fun or whether you're trying to evoke a very specific tone and giving the players an incentive to try and achieve that tone with you. But overall, think about the number of XP you think they should have by the end of the campaign, like going into the last couple of sessions for their ultimate climax. Should they be really weak or should they be very powerful? Oh, and another tip for this bit specifically, don't be afraid to give your players specific dots in things. Like, don't give them XP, just say, oh, you have a dot in the firearms skill now because you just shot a bunch of people, or have a point of resources that, you know, I might take away later if you lose this sack of cash. And now something to help you prepare as you're going along. Now, this one's a bit more practical. How do you sort out all of those backstory and NPC and character sheet elements for your players? That's really, really hard. And honestly, I haven't nailed it down. I sometimes have huge Google Docs that are just random notes that I type down. So I'm not going to pretend like, oh, I've got a perfect system. Oh, I use Obsidian. I know some people use Obsidian to sort their notes. I'm not that prepared, so I'm not the best for this. But one tip that I can give you is to use kumu.io. This is something I do use, and I'm going to quickly show it to you here. Now, this is the character and NPC sheet, and factions are on here as well that I used for Leech Season 1 over on Table Story. These big red dots in the middle, those are the players. And on there, there's, hang on, will it come out? There's a sidebar on the left. It had some notes like what powers do they have? That kind of thing. Or like little notes that I've got down for things that will happen to them. I also have NPCs on here with connections between who their child is, who they were friends or enemies with, and what faction that they belonged to. And there is a VTM relationship map template that I will put in the link description link for you to use this with all of the colored lines and dots and nodes. That makes my life so much easier when I'm preparing. I just literally just write down the name of a person. I know who it's connected to. I know whose NPC they are, whose touchstone they are, what their relationship is, and whether they like them or not. And this is really, really easy to read because you can just drag things around yourself. And this is, I mean, straight up one of the most practical tips that I've had in this entire video. Just use kumu.io. It's really free, really, really free. Very easy to use. So thanks everyone for watching. Follow if you're into tabletop or minis or vampires in general, because I'm going to be doing hopefully another one of these. There was a really great bunch of questions that I got in response to the post that I made asking for what would be helpful as a new GM. So hopefully I'm going to go through more of those because those are more either specific questions or wider questions or things that I haven't covered here. So hopefully I can do like a comment response video really soon. But yeah, I really appreciate you watching. And until next time, don't be a stranger.